Okay, so yeah, there's a picture of William F. Allen. You'll see him a couple times. So sort of the subjects I'd like to cover this evening, starting with Allen's family and background. And one of the major sections will be the founding of Wenonah and his involvement in the West Jersey Railroad. And then for later on in his career, we'll talk about his work with Standard Time and how that sort of revolutionized timekeeping. And then he had a career, afterwards, after he invented Standard Time. We'll talk about that. And then we'll speak about, not really directly related to his lifetime, but sort of follow up with what happened to Wenonah, what happened with this thing that he put into motion. And we'll cover some of the railroad and non-railroad evolution of Wenonah. So I'd like to just define a few terms first that I'll be using this evening. One of them is a metrologist, which is basically one who studies, or basically the study of measurement, as opposed to a meteorologist. That's someone who studies the weather, you might see on TV. And then a scientist versus an engineer. A scientist is one who conducts scientific research, to advance knowledge, whereas an engineer is more of a practical orientation, one who uses scientific principles to design and build machines. So we'll start out with Allen's family and background, starting out with Allen's father, Joseph Warner Allen. He was a native of Bristol, Pennsylvania. Joseph's ancestors were Quakers, but he decided to leave that religion after he married to become a Protestant Episcopal. He worked as a surveyor and a civil engineer on early canals and railroads, both in New Jersey and in other states. And he also served as a state senator from Burlington County. At the outset of the Civil War, Allen was appointed assistant quartermaster general by the governor. And in a military sense, a quartermaster is one who sort of requisitions supplies. In this case, he was also involved in recruiting. He recruited and commanded the 9th New Jersey Volunteer Infantry, which was a regiment of 1,200 sharpshooters known as the Jersey Muskrats. You might guess from Allen's 1862 death date that his Civil War service did not have a happy ending. He and his regiment were sent to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, to participate in Burnside's expedition. On January 15th, 1862, he had just notified his superiors of the regiment's arrival and was returning in a rowboat with 3 other officers when a wave capsized their boat, and both Allen and the regiment's chief surgeon, Frederick Weller, were both drowned. Now, his and Weller's bodies were both given a state funeral in Trenton. Allen was buried at Christ Church Cemetery in Bordentown that you see here, where the men of the regiment later erected the monument in his honor. So you can see that he was esteemed not only by the state government for his service, but also by the people whom he commanded in his regiment. Now, at the time of his father's death, William F. Allen was only 16, and he was attending the Protestant Episcopal Academy in Philadelphia. At the end of that school term, he cut short his schooling in order to support his family, and he went to work as a surveyor. And you can see here on this slide, he worked in several railroad positions, both as a surveyor and an engineer. The Camden and Amboy, was an already existing railroad at that point. It was, I imagine, some expansion project he was working on. Some of these other lines, he was probably doing surveying for, the original construction of railroads at various locations around the state. So let's talk about William F. Allen's involvement in the West Jersey Railroad and how that factored into the founding of Wenonah. This map shows some of the early railroads in New Jersey, and I've sort of separated them out by color to emphasize some of them. The one in red here is the Camden and Amboy, which I'm sure many of you know was one of the very early U.S. railroads, started in 1830 and by the Stevens family. The state granted it a monopoly on Philadelphia to New York City rail traffic the portion from Camden to Bordentown, you know today as the River Line. The first West Jersey Railroad, which is shown in blue here, was also chartered, I should say, in 1830, but it started operating only Camden to Woodbury in 1838, and it operated until 1846. It was not a very financially successful company. They certainly had some ambitions to build on southward to Cape May, but those were never realized. There was a second West Jersey Railroad that was founded, as you see, in 1853, and they reused the original right-of-way of the first West Jersey Railroad, and they opened to Woodbury in 1857. They got financial assistance from the Camden and Amboy. That was actually part of the state's conditions of extending the Camden and Amboy's monopoly on that New York City rail traffic to 1869. Again, there were some ambitions to build southward to Cape May, but construction south of Woodbury was halted in 1855. Locally here in Wenonah, there's an old farm known as the Stone House Farm, and an 1855 deed for that property mentions that it was located adjacent to the contemplated West Jersey Railroad, but it didn't actually arrive in Wenonah until several years later, as you'll see. In green here, we have the Millville and Glassboro, which was organized by wealthy merchants in Millville and Glassboro who were frustrated by the West Jersey Railroad's expansion plans that were not coming to fruition. You can see that there was a gap here for a time between Wenonah and Glassboro. So the Millville and Glassboro opened their line between those two cities in October 1860. The West Jersey Railroad said that the gap between these two railroads was no big problem. Just hire a stagecoach, to travel or move freight between the two places. But compared to a train, stagecoaches are uncomfortable for passengers and not very efficient for heavy freight. So the Millville and Glassboro threatened to extend their line northward up to Woodbury. In response, the West Jersey Railroad quickly extended their line south to Glassboro instead. And that expansion opened on April 6th, 1861. And that was just 6 days before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. So after the war, by 1866, two of the West Jersey Railroad's original leaders had passed away, both the original president and the original chief engineer. Thomas Jones York here in the upper right was named as the new president, and General William Sewell at the bottom right here was named as superintendent. Sewell was a decorated hero of the Civil War, especially he's known for his actions at the Battle of Chancellorsville. 1868 was a very eventful year for our story. That's when the Millville and Glassboro sold their line to the West Jersey Railroad. And also in that year, that's when William F. Allen was hired as the resident engineer of the West Jersey. So this map here is sort of a combination of an old map of Wenonah with the modern street grid of Wenonah laid over top of it. The green line here is Mantua Avenue, which is sort of the main street in Wenonah, modern Wenonah. And then the blue line is the modern Conrail Vineland Secondary. And you can see a thick black line sort of curving off to the left here. This is the original route of the West Jersey Railroad that opened in 1861. And the other very important geographical feature here coming from upper left to lower right is the Mantua Creek. And you can see the crossing here of the Mantua Creek. And just south of it was what was known as the original Mantua Station on the West Jersey Railroad. So how does Wenonah factor into our story here? The original West Jersey Railroad line was constructed, as I said, very quickly and on the cheap. They had some steep grades in this area approaching Mantua Creek and some curvature. It's not totally evident on this map, but there was some curvature. And it basically posed a lot of operating problems for freight trains. The original alignment is sometimes described in local histories as narrow gauge, but my research showed that it was actually slightly wider than standard gauge. It was 4 foot 10 inches. And they later actually narrowed the tracks to be more compatible when the Pennsylvania Railroad took over the West Jersey to be compatible with the rest of the Pennsylvania system. So modern day Winona is fortunate to have 6 miles of natural surfaced hiking trails. And there are two places in our town where you can see the original West Jersey alignment. Here on the left, the trail extending out from the Wenonah Lake parking lot is sort of wider and flatter than most of our trails. And that's because it's the original 1861 railroad bed. And the line then extended, as I showed on the map, sort of southward and uphill, approaching the Mantua Creek. Approaching the Mantua Creek, the railroad had to build a rather large embankment so it could cross a bridge over into Mantua Township. We call this place Clay Hill today because it's obviously an artificial hill made of clay. And you can see that we built some steps in the modern era here to help hikers walk over and across that artificial embankment. Part of Allen's job starting in 1869 was undoubtedly to straighten this operating problem I mentioned and reduce the punishing grade. And this involved making a new track alignment all the way from today's Woodbury Heights. That was a location known then as Cooper's Hill, all the way about 3 miles south into Barnesboro. The photo that you see here is looking northward from the Mantua Creek toward the Willow Street crossing, the southernmost grade crossing of the tracks in Wenonah. And the embankment that you see here, like Clay Hill, is not natural. That Allen would have had to acquire land from the local sweet potato farmers and move in a fairly massive amount of fill dirt. And you can imagine in that era where they didn't have, a lot of mechanized equipment, there was a lot of horsepower, I'm sure, and manpower needed to accomplish that. So the new alignment bypassed the Mantua station that I showed you on the map a moment ago. So a new Mantua station was established in what's today's Wenonah, near the Stonehouse Farm. And on October 10th, 1870, the new alignment opened for traffic. The photo you see here is a later photo, and we know that for a couple reasons. One of them is the second track, which was not an original part of the alignment, and also that the road here is the main street of Wenonah, Mantua Avenue. It's crossing at right angles to the tracks. Before Wenonah existed, there were some farm roads and things like that that were not quite so straight and were not, perpendicular to the railroad like this. So Allen and General Sewell at some point came up with the idea of constructing a suburban town in these sweet potato fields that they were their new alignment moved through. Allen secured the agreement of 7 owners to sell a total of 572 acres of land. And so now they had a question, well, what to do with this land? And so barely 2 months after that new alignment opened on December 14th, 1870, Allen invited a group of 21 businessmen to his office in Camden to discuss building a new town. And if you'll recall the Millville and Glassboro, that upstart railroad that had embarrassed the West Jersey Railroad into building this line south of Woodbury in the first place, by 1868, they had been acquired by the West Jersey, and the former president of the railroad, Samuel Whitney, who was a glass manufacturer, prepared a business plan for this new suburban town venture. And 5 days later, after that first meeting, this same group of businessmen reconvened in Allen's office to hear Whitney's proposal. And they then boarded a special West Jersey Railroad train that took them to New Mantua Station to inspect the area. Now, in this slide here, you can see a very early prospectus for Wenonah, and it showed the type of steamship that you would have used to cross the Delaware River at that time. It showed a 440 American locomotive kind of speeding south of Camden on the West Jersey line. And most importantly, it showed you several types of very stylish at that time Victorian houses that you could have built in this brand new suburban town. So the Mantua Land and Improvement Company was organized in February 1871, and it completed the land purchases that I mentioned from the local farmers. Samuel Whitney, General Sewell, and West Jersey Railroad President Thomas York were among the directors. Allen ended up being treasurer of this company, not a director, but it was really Allen's land and water surveys and his street layout that really got the town started. He really was, in effect, the Wenonah's first borough engineer. The Wenonah House that is shown here is a 40-room hotel that opened in the spring of 1872. It was probably the first non-railroad structure in the new town. Each of the 40 rooms was outfitted with gas lighting and running water. That was, sort of advanced technology for that time. According to a newspaper account, it was, quote, furnished in an elegant style. And as mentioned in the ad, there was an agent on the property who was ready to be there and sell you a lot to build your nice new Victorian house in the new town of Wenonah. This is the only document the Wenonah Historical Society has with Allen's own writing on it. I should mention the New York Public Library does have quite an extensive collection of Allen's writings. But what we have here is a very simple note, a very, I'm sure, pedestrian thing in his everyday work. It said, please have the enclosed road papers recorded and obliged, yours truly, William F. Allen. I found it sort of interesting where his office was at the foot of Bridge Avenue. Camden has changed a lot in 150 years, and I think if you look for Bridge Avenue on a map, you won't find it. The best I could figure comparing maps is that this would be somewhere in the area of Wiggins Waterfront Park next to the aquarium. That's where the West Jersey had their ferry and railroad station. This is just, I think, an outstanding photograph that shows not only the Wenonah House sort of off here on the right, but also some of the early houses in Wenonah and two early flat cars of the West Jersey Railroad. And they're on sort of a siding, I think, that's extending up in here into the center of town. The country lane that you see running here is today's Mancho Avenue, sort of the main street, as I mentioned, in Wenonah. I'm not going to really delve any deeper into Wenonah's early history in this presentation, but if you're interested in more details about that, the Wenonah Historical Society does sell a book that covers this subject in much more detail. I should also mention that William F. Allen married Carolyn York, who is the daughter of Thomas Jones York, the railroad president in 1871. So during the time that he was working, Allen was working for the West Jersey. So let's move now to a later phase in Allen's career involved with standard time and how that sort of revolutionized timekeeping, both in the United States really and around the world. So why is telling time important in the first place? I think going back into probably ancient times, there were certainly religious reasons for knowing what time it was, to know what time it was to come to services, and in some cases prayer times, and also for getting the time of personal rituals like meals. So what we see here on the left is what's maybe the oldest surviving mechanical clock in the world. This is Salisbury Cathedral in England, and this device was built in 1386. And it doesn't have a clock face that you can see on the outside. It just chimes the hour, I believe. And on the right, we have a German lantern clock from a couple centuries later in 1570. And this is a personal clock, but personal clocks like these were only affordable to the very wealthy at that point. You notice that there's no minute hand on this device. There's just an hour hand. But a very early example, I think, of personal timekeeping. So time was also critically important for sea navigation. Mariners could easily obtain latitude using a sextant, which is the device that the gentleman in the upper left here, or upper right here, is using. Longitude, however, could only be determined in the early days by astronomers on land using telescopes and astronomical instruments. It was not something that you could practically do on the deck of a heaving ship. And I think many of you are familiar with the Mason-Dixon line, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Charles Mason, one of the surveyors of that line, one of his big jobs, besides actually laying out the line, was doing astronomical measurements to make sure that they were in the right place. So that's an example of how you would use how longitude was so critical for surveying and navigation. Now, this challenge of longitude drove several European countries to offer rewards for a method to determine longitude at sea, with a specified accuracy, maybe 30 miles or better. The problem was not really fully solved until the Englishman John Harrison perfected the marine chronometer in the mid 1700s. This device could keep accurate time on a long voyage despite the temperature and humidity changes, and despite the motion of the ship and perhaps gravitational changes from place to place. So that was quite a revolutionary device. And actually, at the lower right here, that's an early picture of one of John Harrison's marine chronographs. So Harrison's device basically enabled lengthy voyages like the one shown here by James Cook, which extended over 3 years that he was away from port. And without longitude, you just were not able to do this sort of lengthy voyage with any sort of certainty, that you would be at the right place. And on this particular voyage, Cook carried a copy of Harrison's chronometer, and it worked very well. And that enabled him to do some survey work in the South Pacific, some of the earliest European surveys, at least, of the land masses of the South Pacific, and in some cases even of Antarctica. So in America, timekeeping, personal timekeeping in the 18th and early 19th century was still mostly for the wealthy. These 3 examples that I've shown here are ones that you can see on exhibit at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia. The 1765 sundial on the left shows sun time, and sun time is a little bit different than clock time due to some irregularities in the Earth's orbit around the sun. It's not a perfect circle, it's really an ellipse. In that era, though, you could look up a correction factor in an almanac to determine what the exact sort of more astronomical time was. These French mantle clock shown here in the center is one that an owner could use by setting time from perhaps a sundial or from church chimes in a nearby town. In America, at least, most towns basically set their clocks by the sun. And then on the right here on the landing is a grandfather's clock. This was actually owned by George's half-brother Lawrence. George himself didn't own a grandfather clock that we know of. Now, in the 19th century, railroads needed accurate time too for safe passage of their trains along single tracks and to maintain schedules, especially passenger train schedules. In Great Britain, the railroads all adopted a single time standard known as Greenwich Observatory Time back in 1848. Their country was small enough that a single time zone would work for the entire country. And sometimes they even carried portable master clocks from city to city on their trains to establish the accurate time in a distant place. Now in America, we had 2 problems. How do you transmit time across great distance on your railroad, and what time do you transmit? The first problem of transmitting time was largely solved by the time that Wenonah came around, and we can sort of see a clue here in this photo how that was accomplished. That was the telegraph. Operators used Morse code to send messages between stations along the rail line. Employees carried pocket watches, really the best pocket watches that were available in that time. For the second problem about what time to transmit, each railroad mostly adopted the time of its home city. Often there was an observatory like the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia or the Naval Observatory in Washington that kept the time for a major city, and the railroads would then adopt that based on the longitude of that place. Now, Western Union and other companies began renting electrically synchronized clocks to jewelers and other businesses, but this really didn't solve the problem of having different time standards in different cities. Now, we're going to rejoin here William F. Allen's career. In 1872, he left the West Jersey Railroad and became assistant editor and then editor of the Traveler's Official Guide, which was then published in Philadelphia. It was a monthly compendium of all things sort of railroad and steamship related. It had timetables, it had maps, it had lists of officers and advertisements for everything from locomotives to ticket punches. Allen, one of his contributions as editor was he started publishing a list of all 71 railroad time standards that were then in use. And you can sort of see them on this 1875 cover all around the edge. And I have a blown up portion here on the right. So how this worked was when it was noon in Washington, D.C., it was 12:07 in Philadelphia or 11:48 in Pittsburgh, and so on. And you can see that for both travelers and railroad officials, dealing with all these varying time standards was a serious inconvenience. Starting in 1875, Allen was elected general secretary of two industry associations that existed to sort out time issues when a train was handed off from one railroad to another. And they also coordinated when railroads would issue their new seasonal timetables. And so, despite Allen's truncated education, he was really a good writer, and he was turning into a metrologist, one who studied measurement. Now, it's not really correct to say that William F. Allen had all the answers to these time problems on how to get out of this mess. As early as 1869, this man, Professor Charles Dowd, had tried to convince railroad officials about the need to move to a standardized timekeeping system, even if cities didn't adopt the same system. The railroads and the U.S. government were generally receptive to to Dowd's ideas, but nobody really wanted to make the first move. Then in 1873, a business depression hit, and that sort of ended discussions for the time being of any changes in how time was kept. Now, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, a number of prominent scientists were starting again to propose solutions to this time problem. And some of them were similar to things Dowd had proposed, like making a single time zone for the entire country. And railroads by this point were rebounding, they were rapidly expanding, and railroad managers really didn't have a lot of time to maybe listen to scientists and listen to an academic approach to the problem. They were just too busy running their railroads. And so in 1881, one of these scientific papers was presented to the General Time Convention. That was that industry association I mentioned a moment ago, of which William F. Allen was still secretary. The railroad officials instructed Allen then to provide a written report on the timekeeping matter. So the following spring, Allen solicited further comment through an editorial in the Traveler's Official Guide. And after reading through the responses, he decides to come up with his own proposal. His office was in New York City by this point, and he worked on his plan during his daily commute from South Orange, New Jersey into the city. So by studying the existing railroad time standards, he arrived at the same 4-hour-based regions as Dowd and some of the scientists, but Allen claimed that these regions made railroad sense, and he wasn't particularly concerned what the scientists thought of them or whether they were scientifically valid. But the map that you see here is the one that Allen himself drew up to explain his proposal. It shows the 4 time zone names that we're familiar with today: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. The longitude lines on this map, which are 75, 90, 105, 120, they're very simple to explain because they did have a scientific basis. If you take the 360-degree circumference of the Earth and you divide by 24 hours in a day, you basically get 15 degrees per hour. And you had to choose also an origin point, the prime meridian, and Allen chose the Royal Observatory again at Greenwich, England. And that had already been used for nautical maps and for sea navigation, as I mentioned earlier. And so it made sense that railroad times should use that as well. So what's unique about Allen's plan versus the ones that came before it is the division points between the regions. Some of the earlier proposals had used like mountain ranges or state borders or things of that nature. But Allen used railroad division points, the places where crews are changed or where trains were handed off between railroads. Now, in some cities like Pittsburgh and Buffalo, this meant that the time zone boundary was literally in the middle of a railroad station. But the time difference in each of these division points was always exactly an hour, not some variable number of minutes. So we can see here that Allen had a lot of experience by this point working within and with the railroad industry. So unlike the scientists, he's able to come up with this proposal that is sort of tailored to the needs of the railroads, and he knows will be acceptable to the railroads. So Allen presented his plan to the General and Southern Railway Time Conventions in April 1883. He contrasted the simplicity of his plan with the existing practices, which he termed as hard scrabble time. And he believed the general public would be very accepting of this proposal. And Allen felt that local time would basically be abolished once the railroads had adopted this new method of timekeeping. So the railroads at this meeting voted unanimously to adopt Allen's standard, but they represented only maybe 10% of the railroad companies in the US and Canada at that time. They delegated the task of convincing the other 90% of the railroads to Allen himself. Allen decided to wait until late August that year to start his campaigning, just weeks before the fall meeting of the time conventions. As Allen said, quote, "I decided the battle, if it was to be won, should be short, sharp, and decisive." The letters and telegrams came pouring into Allen's office. Many supported the plan. Some had questions, some had objections. Allen says he wrote about 510 letters, 100 telegrams, and distributed thousands of maps and circulars during this sort of campaign to adopt, the new proposed time standard. At the two fall meetings of the time conventions in October, the railroads overwhelmingly voted to adopt Allen's time, and they were going to make this changeover at an arranged time in November, I think, when timetables would normally be changing for the railroads anyway. So this led to what's known as the Day of Two Noons, November 18th, Sunday, November 18th, 1883. Allen had successfully convinced most railroads anyway, to make the switch. And as I mentioned, he really wanted the general public to adopt these standards as well. So he lobbied observatories, he lobbied mayors, he lobbied the telegraph companies so that they would operate their public clocks and also their time balls on standard time. And you can see a picture of a time ball here. And what it is basically the same thing that you're familiar with seeing on Times Square, the ball dropping on New Year's Eve. Only in the 19th century, this was a vital instrument, a vital service for ships navigators, because these time balls were mounted high above a port area, and the ship's navigators could set their marine chronometers by a designated time each day when the time ball would drop, and that would allow them then to navigate, as I described, accurately at sea. The railroads picked this Sunday for the transition because the fewest trains would be running then. They issued orders to employees telling them when and how this transition would take place, how to adjust their watches. And so in addition to actually adjusting their watches, the trains were instructed to stop at the next station after the changeover and to verify the entire crew's watches with the telegraph operator at that station. Newspapers of the day described the public as being a little bit bewildered, I would say, by this change. Many public officials supported the change, but a few felt that it was sort of going against the natural order of things. As I'll describe in a moment, places in the eastern half of each time zone actually did have two noons. You either had to basically temporarily stop your clock or move it backward. In the western half of each time zone, you had to move your clock ahead to sort of catch up with the new time. So Wenonah, as it turns out, is just 8 miles west of the 75th meridian, which is the center of the Eastern time zone. And some of you who are perhaps up in Camden County or even closer to the 75th meridian, if you were the manager of the Wenonah House on the day of two noons, and if you were a stickler for accurate time, you would have needed to set your hotel clock and pocket watch 36 seconds faster to conform with the new standard. Since Wenonah was a railroad town, it almost certainly fell in line with the West Jersey Railroad, which was by then controlled by the Pennsy. Now, on the edges of each of the time zones, if you think about a place like Buffalo or think in Maine, they would have had much larger corrections to their clocks, perhaps at half an hour or so. Now, so after the railroads successfully made their transition, there was this conference held in Washington, D.C. in 1884 to address some other related issues of timekeeping. The Greenwich Prime Meridian, they wanted to establish that internationally as the sort of origin point for all time zones and all timekeeping and navigation. They had this idea of the day beginning at midnight, and you might think, well, doesn't the day always begin at midnight? Well, it turns out astronomers, going back many centuries did not begin their day at midnight. They began their day at noon, because if you think about it, they're making their observations at night, and they didn't want to be concerned about changing a calendar date, in the middle of their observations. So Allen was one of the U.S. delegates to this meeting, and he argued that standard time should be adopted internationally for ordinary uses, the public, not just railroads, and that universal time should be reserved just for science and for international communication, which at that point was just the telegraph. At the end of the conference, the delegates could not agree, and so the time zones were not, established, through a treaty, I would say, at this time. But some countries definitely did adopt Allen's ideas progressively in the 1880s and later. So in the US, Allen had done a great job of building consensus, but the US government actually didn't adopt time zones officially until World War I. The Standard Time Zone Act of 1918 established zone boundaries, which are shown here in solid lines, and they differed slightly from Allen's original, sort of railroad-focused division points. And the other change that was made in World War I was the temporary adoption of daylight savings time. Daylight savings time was repealed after the war, and it also returned temporarily in World War II, but not until 1966 did daylight savings become a permanent measure, not just a wartime sort of measure. In the last several years, there have been efforts underway in several states and in Congress to observe daylight savings time year-round. And there are also, on the other side, sort of some advocates who just want to keep us on standard time all year round. And there are various reasons that are being advanced for this. One is, not having to sort of fight your body clock twice a year that many of you are familiar with during the time change, and also for reducing energy usage. Another possible reason for ditching daylight time. So let's talk briefly about Allen's later career after the time zone activities he was involved in. In 1886, the two time convention organizations that he was a part of merged and began working on the safety critical aspects of railroading, like how to issue orders over a telegraph, how to provide hand signals in a standard way, and also how automatic signaling should be used. And in that era, things such as semaphores were just coming into use, and they needed to establish some standards on what the various indications should be. Allen remained in this position as the secretary of this committee, and the successor, which was known as the American Railway Association. He stayed involved with numerous professional societies, and this is all in addition to his day jobs as editor of the Traveler's Official Guide and other businesses such as fire alarm companies. And he maintained these pivotal roles in the railway industry really for the rest of his life. I haven't said much about Allen's personal life besides his marriage, so I guess a few words are in order about that. He and Carolyn lived in three places in New Jersey: in Bordentown, in Montclair, and in South Orange. The home that's shown here is the one that they built new in 1886 in South Orange. They had four sons, three of whom were born in Camden, and the last in South Orange. Allen was involved in the civic life of South Orange. He founded something known as a Meadowland Society, which seems to have been a cross between sort of a private club and a homeowners association. We can sort of get another glimpse into Allen's personal life through his 1900 passport application. At this time, he was 53 years old, 5'10.5" tall, with gray hair, and he was proposing to go abroad with his wife and his 19-year-old son, John, for up to 6 months. And based on what I've seen of his professional responsibilities, he certainly deserved a vacation. So Allen died in 1915 at the age of 69 at his home in South Orange, and he's buried here in this family plot in Orange. And his wife, Carolyn, passed away over 20 years later in 1937. There are at least two public memorials to Allen that I'm aware of. The one shown here is on the former Bordentown City Hall building, dedicating the clock tower in Allen's honor. Allen was born in Bordentown, as I mentioned. And then we have this plaque that's in Washington, D.C. Union Station. It reads in part, by his zeal, wisdom, devotion, and integrity, he won a commanding position in the administrative councils of America's railways. This tablet is erected in memory of his life and services by the American Railway Guild, of which he was a founder. And it shows, and this close up here, the 5 time zones of Allen's original proposal, of course, with the Washington, D.C. Eastern time zone being at noon, just like on the cover of his Traveler's Official Guide. So let's talk a little bit about how General Sewell and William F. Allen's railroad suburb turned out. How did Wenonah turn out after it had been carved out of the sweet potato fields and they had built a hotel? So the building that you see here in the background is actually the same Wenonah House hotel building that I showed in that advertisement earlier. In 1904, this became the main building in the Wenonah Military Academy, which explains the military drill that you're seeing here in this picture. The academy educated up to 200 cadets in military discipline and mathematics, classical literature, athletics, and even horsemanship. It was known as the West Point of South Jersey, and its graduates could really expect an easy path onto the real West Point or to a prestigious university. The school's location was advertised to parents as being removed from the, quote, dangerous enticements of the city, and yet it was easy to get to thanks to the West Jersey Railroad. Then, as now, Wenonah is a dry town. This was all part of the sales pitch about instilling morality in the young cadets. So the academy flourished for many years, but it fell victim to the Great Depression, closing in 1935. And the only physical remnant of the academy that you'll see today in Wenonah is a stone wall where that main academy building once stood. In 1893, when the hotel was still a going concern, the West Jersey Railroad built the much larger station building that you see here on the east side of the tracks at Mantua Avenue. In 1906, the line to Millville was electrified using a combination of overhead trolley wire for the first few miles in Camden, and then third rail further south, including here in Wenonah. The Newfield to Atlantic City segment was electrified at the same time, and that made an all-electric route from Camden to the shore. And this helped the Pennsy gain some experience in DC electrification, because at this time they were in the midst of building the Penn Station in New York City and all the associated river tunnels that would not have functioned without, a working and reliable, electrification system. Now, the Atlantic City electric trains were discontinued in 1931, although the Millville electrification continued on for nearly 2 decades longer, as we'll see here in a moment. Now, disaster struck the West Jersey just before the end of World War II in July 1945. Heavy rains completely washed out the Mantua Creek culvert, sort of severed the line between Wenonah and Sewell to the south. The newspaper headline that you read here is, "This is not a railroad trestle." So the railroad was forced to use buses between the two places while the line was repaired. And so the repair that they chose to put in was a wooden bridge rather than a culvert. And I imagine the choice of wood was probably due to wartime metal restrictions. To my eye, this bridge looked like something out of an old Western movie, but as we'll see, it actually survived for over 60 years. And for the first 10 years of its existence, it was a 2-track bridge, not the 1-track shown here. So here we're looking across the tracks at Wenonah Station, and we can date this photo to between 1949 and 1955 by 2 factors. One is that the third rail has been removed, and second of all is that steam is still in use. In 1948, the state outlawed the use of wooden passenger cars, which really sidelined most of PRSL's electric fleet. The next year, they were facing increasing maintenance costs on that 40-year-old electric system, and they decided really to pull the plug and stop the electric trains. So the locomotive that you see in full view here, the number is a little bit hard to read, but I think it's PRSL 6075, which is a Class H10S 280 consolidation built for the Pennsy in 1916 and transferred over to PRSL in 1946. There's also a second, much smaller locomotive hiding here behind the passenger shed I think that might be a Reading Camelback, but I'm not entirely sure on that. So here's a view of the Wenonah station from the 1950s. Obviously, railroads were no longer the primary way that people got from place to place, and especially to Wenonah. But the 1893 station is still hanging on. The tracks at Wenonah even made the pages of Life magazine. This is on August 27th, 1956. And we're looking south toward Mancho Creek from the Willow Street grade crossing. Looks like the signal department got here a little bit ahead of the track department, but the track department will soon be pulling up that second track. The 119, I think, here refers to 11.9 miles from Camden. Just south of this grade crossing, there is a modern day 12.0 mile marker. Now, the wooden Mancho Creek trestle had a good run, as I mentioned, but by 2010, its time was up. Conrail and their contractors really mounted a pretty impressive demolition and construction effort, which, as I recall, took just a couple of weeks in April. I live about a half mile from this location, but I could feel the vibrations in my house when they were using a pile driver. Despite the bridge's remote location, it unfortunately attracts some graffiti, much more now than you see here in this particular photo. And I took this picture just last week. This is the weekday evening northbound train. For most of the time I've lived in Wenonah, the northbound always ran at about 9 p.m. and the southbound at 1 a.m. But in the last couple of months, the schedule was shifted 3 hours earlier for some reason. I'm not sure, but it certainly, I'm not complaining because it makes photography like this much less challenging. In this particular spot, there are a ton of trees and it's a little hard. You sort of have to shoot against the sun, but hopefully I got something decent there. Wenonah today is a completely built out residential community. There are a few small businesses on the main street. There's a greenhouse and a bank, and that's pretty much it. As I mentioned, the town has 6 miles of walking trails on 120 acres of conservation land. That's about 20% of our entire land area here, this 1 square mile borough. Many of the houses that were built in the first 20 or 30 years of Wenonah's existence are still around. The house that you see here is not the largest Victorian in town, but it's the prettiest in my opinion. The Wenonah Historical Society sells special markers for houses that are over 90 years old. There are over 120 such plaques now, and only really a few recent cases of historical houses being demolished, to put up something else. This photo is also a good representation of the trees, the mature trees that line our streets. One of Wenonah's volunteer organizations is a shade tree commission that surveys and maintains these shade trees. So earlier I showed you the 1870 New Mantua station. When that structure was made obsolete by the new station in 1893, they just moved it a few hundred feet down the street and it became a private residence. And it's a little hard to see here behind the trees and the shrubs, but that is the same structure. Today, it's right next to our post office and right across the street from our municipal building. So the 1893 station also survives to this day, and there's a great story behind its survival. Back in 1971, the bankrupt Penn Central was looking to sell unneeded real estate so it could raise cash, and passenger services had stopped by that time. Wenonah Station was in the process of being sold so it can become a retail location, probably a deli or something similar. Wenonah's mayor at the time, Jack Shepard, happened to be researching old deeds, and he found the 1893 land transaction between the West Jersey Railroad and the borough. And the deed specified that the property could be used for railroad station purposes only. Now, when Shepard brought this evidence to Penn Central, the railroad dismissed his objections and they said the deed's restrictions were invalid. The borough ended up suing in Superior Court and they won. And the railroad sold the station to the borough in 1972 for a fairly nominal $3,000. And as part of the agreement, the borough had to pay the railroad a $25 a year rent for the portion of the roof that extends over the tracks. So now that the borough had the building, there was a question of what to do with it, how to transform it into a community asset. For that, the borough assembled a small army of volunteers who worked on the roof, and they painted the outside and fixed the walls and flooring inside. My understanding is it took several years to complete, but it was ready by the end of 1976, just after the nation's bicentennial. One of the station's initial uses was as a borough hall with a few offices and the tiny upstairs offices. And they also held borough council and court meetings in the main waiting room downstairs. But the other use of the building, which continues to this day, is as a community center for various volunteer groups, such as the Lions and the American Legion, the Environmental Commission, and the Historical Society. Here you can see a glimpse of the main waiting room with plenty of people inside milling around. The bird decorations that you see on the walls are actually temporary. This photo was taken during one of Wenonah's unique vulture festivals, which celebrated these sort of underappreciated birds that often perch on top of our Victorian houses here in town. So I can't talk about railroads in Wenonah without mentioning the proposed Glassboro-Camden line. This is a controversial subject in Wenonah and maybe among some members of this group too, so I'll just stick to the facts. So after many years of proposals and studies, the final environmental impact statement for the GCL was released back in February. It calls for an 18-mile diesel light rail system along the Conrail Vineland Secondary. And part of the plan includes a 2-platform station in Wenonah, similar to the one that you see here in the sort of computer rendering of the station at Rowan University. The station in Wenonah would be located just north of the community center. Presumably they would move that far enough north that the northbound trains wouldn't foul the Mantua Avenue crossing when they stop. So the number of tracks would increase as this diagram shows. This is straight from the environmental impact statement. At the northern edge of Wenonah and continuing northward, today's 1 track would become 3 with a full-time dedicated track for Conrail's use. Through most of Wenonah and southward, 1 track would be added, and that track would be shared with Conrail at night, similar to how the River Line operates. So the voters of Wenonah are on record in 2014 as opposing a station being built in town. The new station is described in planning documents as being a walk-up facility, but some in town are concerned that the streets and parking spaces would become clogged with cars from our neighboring communities. Another general concern unrelated to the station is horn noise, because the trains would be coming through the town's 3 grade crossings all day, every day, as opposed to just 2 trains a weekday that Conrail currently runs. But I don't want this presentation to end on a controversial note, so I'll close with a more upbeat message. Besides the physical aspects of Wenonah and its origins as a railroad suburb, Wenonah is all about volunteers. The town has a number of organizations that have served the area for 50 years, 70 years, or even longer. Here on the street side of the community center with its 1893 historical marker, you can see the members of the American Legion. They're getting ready to place small flags up and down the main street just before their Memorial Day parade this year. The Wenonah Legion just celebrated its 100th birthday last year. So one of Wenonah's earliest traditions carried down to the present day is celebrating July 4th in patriotic style. Although some politicians march in this parade, the day of festivities is entirely volunteer driven and is funded by community and business donations. The parade this year will be on the morning of July 3rd, Saturday at 8:30 a.m. sharp if you're interested in attending. So I think William F. Allen would recognize and approve of the town that he helped set in motion 150 years ago. It's a town that's never forgotten where it came from. It was a country town created by the railroad in Victorian times. It was known for its clean air, its clean water, and its respect for the surrounding environment. And despite the economic challenges of being a small residential community, that spirit continues to drive Wenonians today to maintain and improve that little town that was carved out from the sweet potato fields on the West Jersey Railroad. So I just wanted to offer my thanks here to some fellow members of the Wenonah Historical Society who helped me out getting pictures and with some material for this presentation. So that is it.
Thank you, Scott. It was very enjoyable.
Oh, thank you.
Anybody, you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Scott any questions that you might have?
Sure.
Scott, very well done.
Oh, thank you.
That was a whole section down there. I can't say, I mean, I've seen it listed a little bit here and there, Scott, but you really, I was going to say, answered my questions without answering them, because I really don't know too much about that section through Wenonah. Now I have a better idea.
Great, yeah.
Just wondering about the ball dropping, and was the critical time always when the ball hits the bottom of the track? And is it obvious to navigators back in the day when it's at the bottom of the track, or when it was starting to travel, or exactly how did they calibrate with the dropping ball?
Well, I think my guess is that the real, like a practical time ball, will drop very quickly. I think the one in Times Square, they drop very slowly for dramatic effect. The real, I haven't seen like a movie of any of like a real time ball, but I get the impression they drop much more quickly on their poles. So.
Well, I think Dick Clark would approve of that information as well. I find it very interesting.
Thank you.
You're all quiet tonight.
By the way, Scott, I'm about 3,000 feet from that 75th meridian
Okay.
where I live. So it happens to cross right at Crescent Road and Route 295. So the other thing I was going to say, you mentioned Harrison, and there was not only a book written named Longitude, but also there was a series about, I was going to say 12 to 15 years ago, they actually made a series of it. It was very, very good. And it showed how, of course, eventually, even though he worked on the ship, to get ships to work right, how it eventually translated over to the railroads, primarily in England, eventually over here.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Also, there are a number of books written about the Mason-Dixon line that I found fascinating. I think one of those is called Walking the Line, and it describes in great detail how it was, I think, the longest sort of artificial land border that had been drawn up to that point. This is in the 1760s, and they were doing this using, very new astronomical instruments. And, when it was remeasured using modern equipment, it was pretty darn close. I mean, what they did.
I think the worst one was something like 150 or 250 feet off. And that was the worst one. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Scott, Vince Jacobask here. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
I have a question for you. Next station down from Wenonah is Sewell. Now, you showed a map, and instead of it saying Sewell, it said Barnesboro. Now, Barnesboro is practically right next door to Sewell. I was speaking to Dale Ledden, who used to work at Ledden's Seed Store in Sewell, and he told me years ago the railroad went through Barnesboro, and his great-grandfather, somebody, made a deal with the railroad and promised the railroad X amount of carloads a year if they would reroute the railroad through Sewell. Do you know anything about that?
I really don't. All I can say is that I bicycle around here quite a lot, and Barnesboro is one of the highest points in the surrounding area, and it's a little hard to imagine the railroad would run up that steep a grade. They would probably want to avoid, and go where the railroad is today in Sewell, at a lower elevation to go onward to Pittman and Glassboro.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Scott, thank you very much for a very interesting program, a little bit off the beaten path. I'm going to say goodnight. I have a 2-day sales trip that I have to make, so I will bid you all adieu. And once again, thank you very much for your time and your effort.
Thank you.
Have a good night, Kevin.
Hey, there, Kevin.
It was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that.
By the way, Scott, in as far as the electrification went, so when did they keep it? I got lost on that a little bit. To the 30s or 40s?
Well, it was it's a Millville that existed until 1949. That's my understanding.
Okay.
The Atlantic City connection, I think, from Newfield to Atlantic City, that was 1931, much earlier.
On the section where it was third rail, how did they get it? I mean, being that there were so many grade crossings, how did they get a third rail across grade crossings?
Well, I think they probably couldn't run a one-car train. I imagine they had to have 2-car trains, so they, would have pickups on both cars. Because yeah, they wouldn't have made it across Mantua Avenue with just a single car. That would have been too big of a gap, I think.
Okay. Okay. It's just curious, just the engineer and me guessing.
Yeah. Well, and I think close to Camden, sort of like I mentioned, there were so many grade crossings, they had to use that trolley pole. It was just impractical, I think, to use third rail, or probably dangerous maybe with all the people around.